I never thought I'd get a call telling me I no longer legally owned my childhood home. My name is Olivia Mercer, but everyone calls me Liv. And at 32 years old, I found myself staring at my phone in disbelief, as our family lawyer explained, that according to county records, I was no longer co-owner of the Victorian house my parents had left to both my brother James and me when they passed away last year. The house where I took my first steps, where Mom taught me to bake her famous apple pie in the kitchen with the blue tiles, where Dad built us a treehouse that James and I fought over until we agreed on alternating days. That house wasn't just property to me. It was the physical embodiment of our family history, the keeper of our secrets and celebrations, the one place I could still feel my parents' presence in every creaking floorboard and familiar scent. When our parents sat us down 5 years ago as Dad's health began to decline, they made us promise to keep the house in the family, telling us that no matter what happened, the house would belong to both of us equally. "Your great-grandfather built this house with his own hands," Dad had said, his voice weaker than I remembered but his eyes still sharp with conviction. "It belongs to both of you, together." James had nodded solemnly then, sitting across from me at the dining room table where we'd shared thousands of family meals. Now, according to the lawyer, James had somehow transferred the deeds solely to himself while I was away helping a friend through a medical crisis. I felt my chest tighten as I tried to process this betrayal from the only family I had left. The same brother who held my hand at both our parents' funerals was now trying to steal my inheritance from under me. The same brother who once promised me we'd always look out for each other had now decided I wasn't worthy of our shared legacy. "You're too emotional to make rational decisions about the property," he'd told me just last month during one of our increasingly heated arguments about renovations. I had dismissed it as his usual condescension, never imagining he'd go this far. As I hung up the phone, a strange calm replaced my initial shock. What my brother didn't realize when he stole our parents' legacy was that I inherited more than just my mother's eyes. I inherited her quiet determination, too. I've always been the softer one of the Mercer siblings, working as a hospital administrator where my empathy serves me well, though James often told me it made me too soft for the real world. At 40, my brother is 8 years my senior, and never let me forget the authority that supposedly came with that age gap. James built a successful career as a real estate developer, turning properties for profit with seemingly little emotional attachment to any of them. Our upbringing in that colonial-style house on Maple Street shaped us both, though in different ways. Dad was old-fashioned, a kind but traditional man who believed in gender roles more than Mom ever did. "James will be the man of the family. Someday," he'd say with a proud clap on my brother's shoulder, even while teaching me to change a tire or fix a leaky faucet. "But you'll be the heart, Livy," he'd add with a wink in my direction. Mom was the mediator, the one who made sure I wasn't overshadowed by James's louder personality and ambitions. She kept meticulous photo albums documenting our childhood, preserved family recipes in her handwriting, and insisted on Sunday dinners together even when James started bringing business calls to the table. Our parents' health began declining. 3 years ago, Dad's heart condition worsening after his second attack, while Mom's early-onset Alzheimer's progressed faster than any of us expected, stealing her memories while leaving her physically present. I took a part-time schedule at the hospital to become their primary caregiver, spending nights in my old bedroom to monitor Dad's oxygen levels and help Mom when she became disoriented in the middle of the night. James visited twice a month, usually on Sundays, but kept his designer suits pristine and his visits brief. "I'm handling all the financial aspects," he'd remind me, as if that contribution equaled the countless hours I spent bathing Mom when she couldn't remember how, or sitting beside Dad during his breathing treatments. I should have seen the warning signs when James sold our family's vacation cabin in the Poconos without consulting me, while Mom was still lucid enough to be heartbroken about it. "It's a financial burden we don't need," he explained dismissively when I confronted him, showing me spreadsheets of maintenance costs as if that justified erasing the place where we'd spent every summer of our childhood. "Dad agrees with me," he added, though when I asked Dad privately, he just looked confused and said, "James knows best about these things." I dismissed the knot in my stomach as stress from caregiving, choosing to believe that despite our differences, James and I would eventually grow closer through our shared inheritance. Even when I overheard him talking to Mom during one of her clearer days, subtly suggesting that maintaining the house would be too much responsibility for Olivia alone, I convinced myself he was just being practical. "Both of you will share the house," Mom had insisted, her voice surprisingly firm despite her condition. "It's big enough for 2 families if you want, or you can decide together what to do with it. James had nodded and kissed her cheek, but the look in his eyes reminded me of when he was 10 and I was 2, and he would agree to share his toys only to hide them where I couldn't reach. I should have known then that a lifetime of seeing me, as the little sister he needed to protect from herself, wouldn't change just because we were adults now sharing an inheritance. Mom's final decline came quickly last winter, her few lucid moments becoming increasingly rare until they disappeared altogether. I'll never forget her last truly present day, when she suddenly recognized me after weeks of vacant stares. "Olivia," she'd said, reaching for my hand with surprising strength. "Promise me you'll stand up for yourself. With James, with everyone." I'd nodded, confused by her sudden clarity and specific concern, and by evening she'd slipped back into the fog that would envelop her until her peaceful passing 3 weeks later. Dad lasted exactly 2 months and 4 days after we buried Mom, as if his heart had simply decided it couldn't beat without her nearby. I was alone with him when it happened, sitting beside his bed reading aloud from his favorite Hemingway novel. He squeezed my hand once, looked at me with sudden awareness and whispered, "The house is for both of you," before closing his eyes for the last time. The double loss left me numb as I operated on autopilot, selecting coffins and flower arrangements, through a haze of grief. James handled the obituaries, death certificates, and financial notifications with efficient precision, keeping his emotions tightly controlled behind his professional demeanor. At both funerals, James delivered eloquent, almost businesslike eulogies that impressed the distant relatives and family friends with their composure, while I struggled through mine with voice breaks and visible tears that prompted sympathetic glances and whispers about poor, emotional Olivia. Aunt Margaret patted my hand at the reception and said, "Thank goodness you have James to handle the practical matters," as if my grief were a deficiency rather than a testament to love. The reading of the will took place in Mr. Patterson's office, our parents' attorney for over 30 years, and a man who had watched James and me grow up. The house and property at 427 Maple Street is to be shared equally between our children, James Edward Mercer and Olivia Grace Mercer, Mr. Patterson. Read from Dad's will, adjusting his reading glasses to look at us over the paper. All financial assets are to be divided equally between them. I felt relief wash over me. Everything was as they'd promised, fair and equal. James nodded curtly beside me, already pulling out his phone to check messages before Mr. Patterson had even finished. "We should sell," James said the moment we stepped outside the attorney's office. "The housing market is strong right now, and that neighborhood could attract developers. We could both walk away with a nice profit." When I expressed my desire to keep the house, at least temporarily while I processed my grief, James scoffed. "It's a liability for someone like you, Liv. The property taxes alone will eat up your savings, not to mention maintenance for a house that age." His tone was the same one he used when explaining why I couldn't have a dog as a child, patient, but uncompromising, as if I were still 8 years old, and he was the all-knowing 16-year-old. I held my ground, reminding him the will specified equal ownership, but I could see in his eyes that this conversation was far from over. A week later, I came home from grocery shopping to find James had cleared out Mom's closet and donated her clothes without consulting me. "It needed to be done," he said when I confronted him, tears streaming down my face as I held the now empty hangers. "You were never going to do it yourself, and we need to start preparing the house for eventual sale." That night was my first alone in the empty house. A bittersweet experience of overwhelming grief mingled with a strange comfort. I walked from room to room, running my fingers over the familiar wallpaper, breathing in the lingering scent of Dad's pipe tobacco in his study and Mom's lavender sachets in the linen closet. When I curled up in my childhood bed, I felt both profoundly alone and surrounded by memories, as if the walls themselves held the echoes of our family's laughter and arguments, celebrations and sorrows. Despite James's increasingly formal emails about property matters and his insistence on referring to our childhood home as the asset, I tried repeatedly to engage him in remembering our shared history there. "Remember when we slid down these stairs in laundry baskets?" I asked when he came by to assess necessary upgrades. He barely looked up from his clipboard. "That's why the banister is loose. Another repair cost." When I found our height markings penciled on the kitchen doorframe and showed him, tears. In my eyes, he glanced at them dismissively. "That will need to be painted over before showings. Buyers want clean slates, not other families' histories." His coldness both hurt and angered me, but I still didn't recognize it as the beginning of a calculated campaign to push me out of my inheritance. I was still clinging to the belief that deep down, beneath his business suits and spreadsheets, my brother valued our shared past and would honor our parents' wishes. The Chicago Medical Conference couldn't have come at a worse time, but as the newest administrator in my department, I couldn't refuse the 3-week training opportunity without risking my position. "I'll check in on the house," James assured me with unusual brotherly warmth. "Don't worry about a thing." During my first week away, his updates were regular but vague. "Handling some minor house business," he texted when I asked what he was doing at the property on a Tuesday afternoon. "Just making sure everything's in order," was his response when I inquired about a charge from a local hardware store on our shared maintenance account. By the 3rd week, his messages came less frequently, and my calls often went to voicemail. An uneasy feeling settled in my stomach, but I chalked it up to separation anxiety from being away from the house for the first time since our parents died. Nothing prepared me for what I found upon my return. Dad's meticulously tended vegetable garden, which I had been carefully maintaining, had been completely bulldozed and replaced with a generic landscaped patio space. Mom's heritage rose bushes, some over 20 years old, were gone without a trace. Inside, the kitchen where I'd learned to cook alongside Mom had been partially demolished, with contractors actively removing the vintage blue tiles that Mom had hand-selected decades ago. The living room walls, once covered in family photos chronicling 4 generations of Mercers, were now bare and freshly painted in a sterile white that made the space unrecognizable. I found James in Dad's study, or what used to be Dad's study before the built-in bookshelves had been ripped out and replaced with modern floating shelves displaying architectural magazines and generic decorative objects. "What have you done?" I barely recognized my own voice, hoarse with shock and rising anger. James looked up from his laptop with mild surprise, as if my reaction was both unexpected and inappropriate. "The upgrades we discussed, obviously. The contractor is making good progress." When I pointed out that we had discussed no such renovations, his expression shifted to one of concerned condescension. "Liv, we talked about all this before you left. You agreed that updating the property was necessary whether we sold or kept it. Don't you remember? We went through all the plans together." His tone and expression were so convincing that for a moment I actually doubted myself. Had we discussed renovations? Had I been so overwhelmed with grief and work stress that I'd forgotten a major conversation? But then I remembered Mom's roses, which I had carefully pruned just before leaving. "I never would have agreed to removing Mom's roses," I said firmly. James sighed, the sound heavy with fraternal patience. "You specifically said the garden maintenance was too much for you. The new landscaping is low maintenance and adds significant curb appeal." Each assertion was delivered with such conviction that I felt like I was losing my mind. The gaslighting continued for days as I discovered more changes. Hallway walls knocked down to open up the floor plan, vintage light fixtures replaced with modern LED recessed lighting, and plans laid out on the dining room table showing even more dramatic renovations to come. I confronted James again when I found a stack of business cards from potential buyers paperclipped to a real estate assessment. "These are just for market value assessment," he explained smoothly. "It's important to know what we're sitting on, investment-wise." Every objection I raised was countered with claims that we had already discussed it, that I had agreed, or that I was being too emotional about a physical asset. When I mentioned our parents' wishes, James's expression hardened. Mom and Dad weren't thinking clearly toward the end. They didn't understand the financial implications of maintaining an aging property like this. The final straw came when I discovered all our family photo albums missing from the hall closet. When confronted, James casually mentioned he had put them in storage for safekeeping during renovations. No information about which storage facility, no receipt, no timeline for their return. That night, I walked across the street to Mrs. Bennett's house, our neighbor of 30 years who had been like a second grandmother to us growing up. "Your brother brought a real estate development team through last week," she told me over tea, her eyes concerned behind her glasses. "He told them the property would be available for commercial rezoning soon. Something about buying out his sister's share." Her confirmation of my suspicions both validated my sanity and deepened my sense of betrayal. Still, I made one last attempt. At reconciliation, inviting James to dinner at our parents' favorite restaurant, appealing to whatever sentimentality might remain in him. "This house is all we have left of them," I said, trying to reach the brother I remembered from childhood. Can't we honor their wishes and find a way to make this work? For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps. Regret. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. The most honorable thing we can do with their legacy is maximize its value, he replied, signaling for the check before I'd finished my meal. And I'm increasingly convinced you lack the business acumen to participate in those decisions. James's takeover of our family home accelerated with alarming precision over the next 2 months. He hired a staging consultant who declared most of the remaining furniture outdated and unsellable, resulting in Dad's handcrafted oak desk being replaced with a glass and chrome monstrosity, and Mom's antique china cabinet dismantled and hauled away while I was at work. The modern buyer wants clean lines and contemporary appeal, James explained when I came home to find the dining room transformed into an unrecognizable showroom space. My protests were met with financial documents highlighting the investment return of each change, as if the erasure of our family history could be justified by percentage points on a spreadsheet. One Tuesday, I returned from my hospital shift to find a crew installing an elaborate security system, complete with cameras in common areas and keypad entry on all exterior doors. For the property's protection, James said, handing me a single keycard and a paper with a temporary access code. When I asked for the master codes, he informed me that as the financially responsible party, he would retain administrative access. I later discovered my code only worked during certain hours and didn't allow access to the renovated sections of the house, effectively restricting me to my bedroom, bathroom, and kitchen when it wasn't under construction. The financial manipulation began subtly, James questioning the utility bills I'd paid from our shared maintenance account, suggesting I was overusing resources when I did laundry twice in 1 week, leaving printouts of electricity usage graphs highlighted in accusatory yellow. Perhaps you should contribute more to offset your higher consumption, he suggested, despite the fact that the inheritance was meant to cover these expenses equally. Then came the bombshell discovery that James had accessed our joint inheritance account, transferring a significant portion to what he called higher-yield investment vehicles in his name only. The savings account was getting pathetic returns, he justified when I confronted him with the bank statement. I'm putting the money to work more efficiently than that savings account ever could. My attempt to contact the bank about unauthorized transfers led nowhere, as James had apparently been added as a power of attorney on all accounts during our parents' illness, something I'd agreed to when overwhelmed with caregiving responsibilities, never imagining he would abuse that authority. Our confrontations grew increasingly heated, with James's condescension evolving into outright sexism. This is precisely why women shouldn't handle property matters, he declared during one argument about contractor payments. You're making emotional decisions about a business asset. When I reminded him that I managed multi-million-dollar department budgets at the hospital, he scoffed. Playing with other people's money in a structured environment is hardly the same as real property management. After a particularly ugly argument about his plans to convert the sunroom where Mom used to read to us into a home gym, James issued his first direct threat. If you can't see the value in these improvements, perhaps I should just buy out your share and save us both the headache. The lowball figure he quoted was barely enough for a down payment on a small apartment, less than half of what my inheritance share should have been worth. I began researching property laws and inheritance rights online during lunch breaks at work, discovering that as co-owner I had far more legal rights than James had led me to believe. This research apparently triggered his suspicion as I returned home one day to find my desk drawers ransacked, papers rearranged, and computer browser history cleared despite the password protection I'd added. The emotional toll became unbearable. I found myself tiptoeing through what was legally half my house, feeling like an unwelcome guest in the home where I'd helped our parents through their final days. I installed a private lock on my bedroom door after finding evidence someone had been through my personal belongings, a bitter irony in the house where I once felt safest. James's final power move before the ultimate betrayal came in the form of an appraiser, a golfing buddy of his. I later learned who produced a valuation of the property significantly below market value. Even with the improvements, the foundation issues and outdated systems bring down the value, James explained, though the home inspection after our parents' deaths had found no foundation problems. The appraiser avoided eye contact with me during the entire walkthrough, his discomfort obvious as James pointed out supposed structural concerns in areas that had been perfectly sound for decades. That night, I sat alone in my increasingly unfamiliar bedroom, surrounded by the few family photos I'd managed to hide from James's purge, and wondered how my own brother could have become a stranger so determined to erase not just my inheritance, rights but our shared history and my sense of belonging in the only home I had ever known. The call from my college roommate Rebecca came on a Thursday evening. She'd been diagnosed with an aggressive form of lymphoma and was facing treatment alone in Arizona with no family to help. "I wouldn't ask if I had anyone else live," she said, her voice breaking over the phone. "I'm scared." Despite my growing unease about leaving the house with James's behavior becoming increasingly controlling, I couldn't abandon my friend in her time of need. 2 weeks, James agreed when I explained the situation, his unexpected supportiveness setting off warning bells I regrettably ignored. Take care of your friend? Family looks out for each other, right? The irony of that statement would only become apparent later. I left detailed instructions about ongoing renovations, which areas were absolutely off-limits for changes, which family items needed to remain untouched. And James nodded along with uncharacteristic patience. "I've got it handled, Liv, trust me." My first few days in Arizona, I called home daily, checking on the house and the progress of the kitchen renovation I'd reluctantly agreed to. James answered with updates that seemed reasonable, even sending photos of work that aligned with the approved plans. Gradually, however, his responses became delayed, messages brief. "Swamped with work and house matters. All good here," became his standard reply. By the end of the first week, he stopped answering my calls altogether, responding only to texts hours later with vague assurances. My anxiety skyrocketed, but with Rebecca facing a particularly rough round of chemo, I couldn't abandon her mid-treatment. The gnawing worry became physical pain as I counted down the days until my return flight, my sleep fragmented with nightmares about coming home to find the house completely demolished. Nothing, however, prepared me for the reality that awaited. My key no longer worked in the front door. The security keypad refused my code with an angry series of beeps and a flashing "access denied" message. I tried every door with the same result, eventually resorting to Mrs. Bennett's emergency spare key that had been hidden under a false rock in her garden for decades. That key slid into the lock but wouldn't turn. The locks had been changed entirely. After 30 minutes of increasingly desperate attempts to enter my own home, including pounding on doors and calling James's cell repeatedly with no answer, I retreated to Mrs. Bennett's porch to regroup. "He's had workers coming and going all week," she informed me, her concern evident. "Big black SUV parked in the driveway yesterday, men in suits. Looked like lawyers to me." I was still sitting there trying to decide whether to call a locksmith or the police, when James's Mercedes pulled into the driveway. I marched across the street, wheeling my suitcase behind me, fury and fear battling for dominance. James emerged from his car in a tailored business suit, leather briefcase in hand, his expression shifting from surprise to calculated composure when he spotted me. "Olivia, you're back early." We both knew I wasn't. "Why are my keys not working, James?" I demanded, struggling to keep my voice steady. He sighed, as if dealing with a difficult child, and gestured toward the front door. "Let's discuss this. Inside." In the entrance hall, now unrecognizable with its minimalist decor and absence of family photos, James set his briefcase on the new glass console table and extracted a folder of legal documents. "I've made some necessary changes. To protect our parents' legacy," he began, his tone rehearsed and emotionless. "I've transferred the deeds solely to my name. It's better this way." The words hit me like physical blows, each one stealing my breath. "You did what?" I managed to whisper, the room beginning to spin around me. James slid the papers across the table, his manicured finger tapping on a signature that looked vaguely like mine but wasn't, a forgery I would later confirm. "It's all legal and finalized. Your signature from last month and the transfer completed while you were away." When I protested that I had signed no such documents, James's expression hardened into something I'd never seen before. Contempt mixed with a twisted sense of righteousness. "You're too dumb to own property, Liv. Dad knew it too. I'm just doing what he would have wanted." The cruelty of his words, the calculated timing of his betrayal while I was helping a sick friend, the realization that my own brother had committed fraud against me, it all culminated in a moment of such profound shock that I physically staggered backward. James continued his rehearsed speech, something about emotional decision-making and protecting the family legacy from poor financial management. But his words became white noise as I struggled to process the magnitude of what he'd done. From his briefcase, he produced an envelope, sliding it across the table with the air of someone being extraordinarily generous. "I'm prepared to offer you compensation for your share. This is more than fair considering the outstanding loans against the property." The check inside was for an amount so insultingly small it wouldn't cover 6 months' rent in a decent apartment. When I refused to accept it, James's facade of reasonableness cracked. "You have until the end of the day to collect your personal belongings," he stated coldly. "I'll supervise to ensure no property of value is removed." The next 4 hours became a blur of humiliation and grief as I packed clothes and personal items under my brother's watchful eye, forbidden from taking anything he deemed property assets, including Mom's handwritten recipe book that had been promised to me. Family photos and frames he classified as antiques, and the quilt my grandmother had made specifically for me. By nightfall, I found myself sitting in a sparsely furnished studio apartment that a sympathetic colleague had helped me secure on short notice, surrounded by hastily packed boxes containing the meager remnants of my life. The final twist of the knife came 2 days later, when I learned James had systematically contacted extended family members, family friends, and even my colleagues, spinning a story about how I had voluntarily signed over my share of the house, in exchange for cash compensation, painting himself as the responsible sibling handling matters properly, while portraying me as financially irresponsible. Several relatives called to express their understanding of my difficult decision, their condescension making it clear they believed James's version of events. Isolated, homeless in any meaningful sense of the word, and betrayed by my only remaining family, I curled up on the unfamiliar mattress in my sterile new apartment and finally allowed myself to break completely, sobbing until physical exhaustion claimed me in a mercifully dreamless sleep. The rock bottom I hit in that anonymous apartment was deeper than any grief I'd experienced, even after losing both parents. At least then I'd had our family home to comfort me, physical spaces that held their presence and memories of happier times. Now, I had nothing but cardboard boxes of hastily packed clothes, a few rescued photos, and the devastating knowledge that my own brother had calculated and executed my removal from my inheritance and family history with the precision of a military operation. "Maybe James is right about me," I whispered to the empty room on my third night there, staring at the water stains on the unfamiliar ceiling. "Maybe I am too emotional, too impractical to handle property." The self-doubt he had so carefully cultivated in me over the past months bloomed into full-blown self-loathing as I replayed every interaction, wondering if I had somehow deserved this betrayal through some fundamental incompetence I couldn't recognize in myself. The spiral might have continued indefinitely if not for the call from Eleanor Jenkins, my mother's best friend for over 40 years, who'd been out of the country during the entire ordeal. "I just got back from my daughters in Australia and heard you moved out of the house," she said, her familiar voice instantly bringing tears to my eyes. "What on earth happened, Olivia?" Something about Eleanor's genuine concern cracked the defensive shell I'd built around my pain, and the entire story poured out of me in a broken, hours-long confession of confusion, betrayal, and humiliation. Instead of the judgment or pity I'd come to expect, Eleanor's response was incandescent fury on my behalf. "That manipulative little snake," she hissed, her proper Southern lady persona evaporating. "Your mother knew he could be calculating, but this would break her heart." Her validation that I wasn't crazy, that this betrayal was real and unjustified provided the first glimmer of solid ground beneath my feet in weeks. "You need Marina Patel," Eleanor declared decisively. "She handled my sister's estate fraud case. Best damn attorney for this sort of thing in the state." The initial consultation with Marina the following day brought the first ray of hope into my darkness. She listened to my story without interruption, her expression growing increasingly grave as I detailed James's escalating control, the forged documents, the systematic isolation. "What your brother has done isn't just unethical," she stated when I finished, her voice calm but vibrating with controlled anger. "It's fraudulent and almost certainly criminal. But we need concrete proof beyond your word against his." That afternoon, I began methodically unpacking the boxes from the house, searching for anything that might help build a case. In the bottom of a box of winter clothes I'd hastily stuffed with random items from my dresser drawer, I found a small blessing, Mom's antique silver compact mirror that she'd used to hide the spare key to her personal filing cabinet. A filing cabinet that James, in his rush to modernize, had likely relegated to the basement storage rather than dispose of due to its potential antique value. That filing cabinet had contained Mom's copies of important documents, including, I suddenly remembered, the original version of my parents' will that she had insisted on keeping separate from Dad's office copies, just in case. Marina's eyes lit up when I called with this information. If we can access that filing cabinet and find the original will, we have our first solid piece of evidence. The investigative process accelerated from there, Marina helping me identify discrepancies in the documents James had presented, particularly the forged signature that, when examined closely, showed clear differences from my authentic handwriting. The transfer itself was rushed through with suspicious speed, Marina noted, reviewing the county records. There are procedural irregularities that a good judge will question. Perhaps the most significant breakthrough came when I was sorting through a box of greeting cards I'd managed to take from the house and found, pressed between anniversary cards, a small handwritten note from Dad to Mom. Made James understand today that both kids get the house no matter what. He didn't like it, but agreed. Love wins. The date was just 3 months before Dad passed away. Marina introduced me to Diana Winters, a sharp-witted attorney specializing in estate fraud who would become the lead on my case. Diana's assessment, after reviewing our growing evidence file, was both encouraging and sobering. This isn't just unethical, it's criminal, but we need concrete proof beyond circumstantial evidence. Ideally, we need your brother to incriminate himself. The strategy Diana proposed was psychologically challenging, but legally sound. Appear to accept defeat while secretly building our case, potentially getting James to incriminate himself through recorded conversations and witness statements. Sometimes the strongest position is letting someone think you're weak, Diana advised, her eyes kind but determined. People reveal their true intentions when they believe they've already won. The prospect of confronting James, even under the guise of surrender, made my stomach churn with anxiety. This was my only remaining family, the brother who had once carried me on his shoulders at the state fair, who had taught me to ride a bike in our driveway. Despite everything, some small part of me still mourned the relationship we might have. Had the shared grief and memories we could have navigated together instead of this ugly battle over property and power. Diana seemed to read my thoughts. Olivia, I've seen this pattern before. Someone who would go to these lengths to defraud their own sister isn't going to have a sudden change of heart. The person you're remembering from childhood isn't the man he chose to become. That night, sitting cross-legged on my apartment floor, surrounded by the scattered evidence of James's betrayal and my nascent fight to reclaim my inheritance, I made the decision to stop being the passive, accommodating sister James had always manipulated. Looking at the last family photo taken before Mom's illness, all 4 of us smiling on the porch of the house James had stolen, I whispered a promise to my parents. I'm getting our home back, and I'm making this right. The next morning, I called James and arranged to meet, my voice carefully modulated to convey defeat and resignation. I just want to talk about what happens next, I told him, the lie tasting bitter but necessary. I need closure. As I hung up, Diana's words echoed in my mind. Remember, you're not just fighting for a house. You're fighting for justice, for your parents' wishes, and for your own self-respect. For the first time since discovering James's betrayal, I felt something other than despair taking root inside me. A quiet, determined resolve that felt remarkably like my mother's presence guiding me forward. Meeting James at an upscale coffee shop of his choosing set the stage for my performance as the defeated sister seeking closure. I arrived deliberately underdressed in faded jeans and a plain sweater, hair pulled back messily, projecting the image of someone struggling financially and emotionally, exactly what James needed to believe. You look tired, Liv, he commented as I slid into the booth across from him, his designer suit and perfectly styled hair creating a deliberate contrast to my disheveled appearance. I forced my eyes to remain downcast, swallowing the rage that threatened to choke me. I haven't been sleeping well, I admitted truthfully, though not for the reasons he assumed. James launched into what seemed like a rehearsed speech about difficult but necessary decisions and responsible asset management, his tone a nauseating mixture of condescension and false sympathy. I nodded at appropriate intervals, playing the role Diana and I had carefully crafted, the emotionally exhausted sister who had neither the energy nor the resources to fight her more powerful brother. I just want to collect a few more personal things from the house, I said hesitantly when he finished his self-congratulatory monologue. Some photo albums, Mom's recipe cards, sentimental stuff with no real value. James considered this with the calculated generosity of someone who believes they've already won. I suppose that could be arranged, under supervision, of course. His agreement to allow me limited access to the house was our first victory, opening the door for the evidence gathering we desperately needed. Over the next 3 weeks, I made 5 separate visits to collect personal items, each one strategically planned to maximize information gathering. While James or his assistant watched me sort through closets and drawers, I secretly photographed documents left carelessly visible on desks, recorded room layouts showing the extensive unauthorized renovations, and located key paperwork James hadn't thought to destroy. During one visit, I accidentally spilled a box of old greeting cards, creating enough diversion to quickly photograph Dad's private journal where he'd explicitly written his wishes regarding the house inheritance. I also began cultivating relationships with the neighbors as potential witnesses, bringing Mrs. Bennett cookies with the excuse of thanking her for her support. James told the Hendersons you had a nervous breakdown and had to be institutionalized. She confided during one visit, her indignation on my behalf making her a perfect ally, said it was why he had to take over the property. For your own good. Similar conversations with other longtime neighbors revealed James had been systematically spreading misinformation about my mental health and financial responsibility, building a narrative to justify his actions should they ever be questioned. Working with Diana, we meticulously documented a timeline of events, gathering bank statements showing James's systematic misappropriation of shared funds, identifying the exact dates of document forgeries, and building a comprehensive case that would be difficult to dismiss. A breakthrough came when we located Mr. Patterson, our parents' original attorney who had been abruptly retired by James shortly after our parents' passing. Your brother presented me with amended documents supposedly signed by your father. Before his death, the elderly lawyer revealed during our confidential meeting, I had doubts about their authenticity, which is likely why I was quickly replaced with his firm's attorney. Patterson's statement, formally deposed and notarized, added substantial weight to our growing evidence file. The most dangerous but potentially most valuable part of our strategy involved recording conversations with James, legal in our state with single-party consent, where he might incriminate himself. I carefully steered our interactions toward discussions of the property transfer, feigning confusion about the process to prompt explanations. I still don't understand how it all happened so quickly, I mentioned during one supervised visit to collect books from Dad's study. James, believing me completely defeated and perhaps enjoying the opportunity to demonstrate his cleverness, became increasingly forthright. The key was timing everything while you were away, he explained with disturbing pride. The right signatures, the right notary who didn't ask too many questions, and fast-tracking the paperwork through a contact at the county office. Each recorded admission became another nail in the coffin of his fraudulent scheme. The most damning evidence came when James revealed his true plans for the property, not preservation of family legacy as he'd claimed, but a lucrative commercial development deal that would demolish our childhood home entirely. Once rezoning approval comes through, we're looking at a 7-figure sale to the developer, he told his business partner during a meeting I was supposed to be too far away to overhear. The residential sentiment was holding back the property's true potential. To gain even more access, I suggested I could help speed up the sale by assisting with staging and showing the property, a role James surprisingly agreed to, perhaps enjoying the irony of having me help sell what he had stolen. This allowed me to be present when potential buyers toured the house, witnessing firsthand James's gross misrepresentations about the property history and his ownership. The final phase of our plan took shape when Diana suggested setting up a meeting with highly interested buyers, actually legal witnesses and an investigator, where James would likely repeat his fraudulent claims in front of credible third parties. The night before this carefully orchestrated trap, I found myself overwhelmed with doubt and fear. What if our evidence wasn't enough? What if James's connections and resources allowed him to escape consequences yet again? What if this final confrontation destroyed even the possibility of ever reconciling with my only remaining family? I called Eleanor in a moment of weakness, seeking reassurance that I was doing the right thing. Your mother faced down your father's entire family to marry him when they disapproved, Eleanor reminded me gently. She never regretted standing up for what was right, even when it cost her relationships. Some principles are worth fighting. For Olivia. The morning of our planned confrontation, I stood in my apartment bathroom, staring at my reflection as I prepared more carefully than I had in months. Professional attire instead of defeated casual wear, hair styled neatly, makeup applied with precision. The physical transformation matching my internal shift from victim to advocate for justice. Before leaving, I touched the silver-framed photo of my parents that had escaped James's purge. Today we set things right, I promised them, straightening my shoulders as I prepared to face my brother and reclaim not just my inheritance, but my self-respect and the truth of our family's intentions. The stage was set in the formal living room of what had once been our warm family home, but now resembled an impersonal model house, stripped of history and character. I arrived early, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain the potential buyers, actually Diana and a real estate fraud investigator named Marcus, would hear it when they arrived precisely on schedule at 2 p.m. James entered from his home office, formerly Dad's study, dressed impeccably in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than 3 months of my rent, his confident smile barely acknowledging my presence as he arranged property documents on the glass coffee table. "The buyers today are particularly promising," I mentioned casually, my voice steadier than I'd expected. They specifically mentioned being interested in the history of the house. James waved a dismissive hand. "History doesn't sell houses, Liv. Investment potential does." The doorbell rang at exactly 2, and I forced myself to breathe normally as I moved to answer it, exchanging a brief, confirming glance with Diana as I welcomed our buyers into the foyer. James switched instantly into his polished realtor persona, extending his hand with practiced charm. "James Mercer, owner and developer. Thank you for your interest in this unique property opportunity." What followed was exactly what we had hoped for. James leading our guests through a comprehensive tour of the renovated house, becoming increasingly comfortable and expansive in his explanations of his plans and ownership. "I acquired sole ownership recently," he explained as they examined the kitchen's high-end appliances. "My sister wasn't financially equipped to handle a property of this value." In the sunroom, now converted to a minimalist office space, he became even more forthcoming. "The transfer process can be complicated, but with the right connections, I was able to streamline everything while my sister was conveniently out of town." By the time we reached the upstairs master suite, James was practically boasting about his strategic maneuvering. "Family properties can become complicated without decisive action," he told Marcus, who nodded encouragingly. "Sometimes you have to take control to protect the asset, even if certain parties don't initially understand it's in their best interest." Throughout this performance, I maintained my supporting role, the compliant sister who had accepted her loss, while Diana asked precisely the right questions to elicit James's most incriminating statements. The pivotal moment came when they discussed the actual transfer of ownership, with Diana inquiring about the process as a matter of professional curiosity. James, perhaps enjoying the opportunity to demonstrate his business acumen to what he perceived as an admiring audience, outlined the process in damning detail. "The key is having the right paperwork with the right signatures," he explained with a confident smile. "Once you have that, the county recorder doesn't ask too many questions." It was time. Diana closed her portfolio slowly and fixed her gaze directly on James. "That's very interesting, Mr. Mercer, especially the part about signatures." The shift in her tone was subtle, but unmistakable. James paused, his expression faltering slightly as he registered the change in atmosphere. I stepped forward, my heart racing, but my voice remarkably calm. "James, I'd like you to meet my attorney. She's very interested in how you forged my signature." The transformation in my brother's face was almost cinematic. Confusion shifting rapidly to shock, then disbelief, and finally a cold fury as comprehension dawned. "This is ridiculous," he sputtered, looking between Diana and Marcus, who had already produced his investigator's credentials. "My sister is clearly unstable. We've been concerned about her emotional state since our parents' passing." Diana opened her briefcase and began laying documents on the table methodically. Original copies of our parents' will, bank statements, showing misappropriated funds, evidence of the forgery, and statements from witnesses including Mr. Patterson and neighbors who had heard James's admissions. "We have quite a comprehensive record of your activities, Mr. Mercer," Diana stated calmly, "including today's recorded admissions about how you orchestrated this fraud." James's business polish cracked completely as he realized the trap he had walked into. "You can't record me without my consent," he snapped, but Marcus shook his head. "Single-party consent is legal in this state, Mr. Mercer. Your sister's consent was all that was required." What followed was a desperate attempt by James to regain control. First anger, "You ungrateful little," then attempts at gaslighting. "This is all a misunderstanding. Liv is confused about what happened." Then finally, desperate negotiation. "We can work something out between us. There's no need for attorneys." When none of these tactics worked, he made a sudden lunge for the documents on the table, but Marcus smoothly intercepted him. "That would be tampering with evidence, Mr. Mercer. I wouldn't advise it." The final piece of our plan unfolded as 2 police officers arrived, having been called by Diana at a prearranged time with sufficient evidence now secured to support a fraud investigation. James's face drained of color as Diana explained the situation to the officers, presenting the documentation we had gathered over the past months. "This is absurd," James hissed, his composure completely abandoned as the officers asked him to accompany them to the station for questioning. "She's trying to steal what I've built. She's always been jealous of my success." As the officers escorted him out, he turned back once, his expression a mixture of rage and disbelief. "I did what Dad would have wanted. He never thought you could handle this." The door closed behind them, leaving me standing in the entryway of my childhood home, suddenly alone with the ghosts of what had happened and the faint stirring of justice being set in motion. I moved slowly through the now quiet house, running my fingers along walls that had been repainted, doors that had been replaced, spaces that had been reconfigured beyond recognition. Yet beneath the renovations, I could still feel the bones of the home where I'd grown up, where Mom had taught me to bake in the kitchen, where Dad had read stories in the den, where our family had been whole once. Diana found me in what remained of Dad's study, staring out the window at the oak tree where our treehouse had once stood before James had it removed. "This is just the beginning," she warned gently. "There will be legal proceedings, possible criminal charges, family fallout. Are you prepared for that?" I nodded, feeling a complex mixture of vindication, sadness, and something approaching liberation. I had to do this. Not just for my inheritance, but because the truth matters. What they wanted matters. The following weeks brought exactly the challenges Diana had predicted. The legal process of reversing the fraudulent deed transfer began immediately, with the family lawyer who had replaced Mr. Patterson now facing his own ethical investigation for participating in the scheme. James was released pending investigation, but faced serious charges of fraud, forgery, and financial elder abuse related to his actions during our parents' illness. Extended family members who had believed James's version of events now faced the uncomfortable truth, some apologizing for their assumptions, others doubling down on taking his side despite the evidence. Throughout the turmoil, I found unexpected strength in finally standing up for myself, in knowing I was honoring my parents' true wishes rather than allowing their legacy to be corrupted. Though the house stood emptier now, stripped of many family treasures James had sold off, I began to feel something I hadn't experienced since before my parents' illness. A sense of being at home in my own life, trusted with my own decisions, capable of fighting my own battles. The most difficult realization, however, was that despite winning back my inheritance, no legal victory could restore what had been irreparably damaged. The brother I had grown up with, fought with, and loved, was now revealed as someone capable of calculated betrayal. The home that had held our family history had been physically altered beyond recognition. Some losses, I was learning, couldn't be reversed by even the most favorable court decision. 3 months after the confrontation that changed everything, I stood in the center of the living room surrounded by moving boxes, but this time they represented my choice rather than my exile. The house had been legally returned to joint ownership, as our parents intended, with a court-appointed administrator overseeing the division of assets James had misappropriated. My brother had accepted a plea deal on the fraud charges, 15 months in a minimum security facility plus restitution, avoiding the more serious penalties he might have faced at trial. The family had fractured along predictable lines, with some relatives maintaining that I had overreacted to James trying to protect the family assets, while others expressed shock and support for my fight for justice. Through it all, I had gradually come to a realization that surprised me. Despite winning back my legal rights to the house, I no longer wanted to live there. Too much had changed, both in the physical structure after James's aggressive renovations and in my own heart after the betrayal and battle. The memories I had fought so hard to preserve now felt tainted by conflict. The comfort I had once found in these walls replaced by echoes of arguments and deception. "Are you sure about selling?" Eleanor asked as she helped me pack Mom's surviving china into bubble wrap. "After everything you went through to get it back?" I nodded, more certain with each box I filled. I fought for what was right, not necessarily to keep the house forever. Mom and Dad wanted us to share it equally. That was the principle worth fighting for. Working with Rebecca Martinez, a compassionate real estate agent who understood the emotional complexity of my situation, I had found perfect buyers for the property, Michael and Sarah Chen, a young couple with 2 small children who saw past the sterile renovations to the potential for creating their own family history within these walls. We can just imagine our kids growing up here, Sarah had told me, her eyes bright with the same hope I recognized from my own childhood. This house feels like it has good bones, good energy. The final confrontation with James came a week before his sentencing, a meeting I had requested despite Diana's concerns. We sat across from each other in the prison's visitor area, the familiar features of my brother now transformed by the setting and circumstances. "Why did you want to see me?" he asked, his voice lacking the confidence that had characterized him throughout our lives. Perhaps it was the prison jumpsuit instead of his custom suits, or the knowledge that his carefully constructed image had crumbled, but he suddenly seemed smaller, older, a man facing consequences perhaps for the first time. "I needed to understand," I replied simply. "Was it always just about the money? Or was there something else?" James was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the table between us. "You were always the favorite," he finally said, his voice barely audible. "Mom and Dad thought you hung the moon. The responsible son, the successful businessman. That was just what they expected from me. But you got their real approval just for being you." The revelation of this perceived reality, so different from my own experience, where I had always felt I lived in James's accomplished shadow, left me momentarily speechless. "That's not true," I finally managed. "They were proud of you. Dad bragged about you to everyone." James gave a hollow laugh. "Dad bragged about what I achieved, what I produced. You he loved for who you were." Whether his perception was accurate or a convenient justification for his actions, I realized in that moment that no explanation could truly repair what had been broken between us. "I'm selling the house," I told him, watching for his reaction. "To a family with young children who will make it a home again." Something flickered across his face, relief, perhaps, or regret. "Probably for the best," he said after a moment. "Too much has happened there now." We parted without the dramatic reconciliation or explosive argument that might have provided cleaner closure. Instead, there was just the quiet acknowledgement that while blood might make us family, his choices had severed the trust that makes people truly remain in each other's lives. The day I signed the house over to the Chens was surprisingly cathartic. I watched their children race excitedly up the stairs to claim bedrooms, their joyful exploration a stark contrast to the tension that had filled those rooms in recent years. "The previous renovations actually work perfectly for us," Michael told me as he signed the final paperwork. "Everything happens for a reason, I guess." As part of the sale, I had requested a private moment alone in the house before officially handing over the keys. I walked through each room one final time, touching door frames where height measurements had once been marked, standing in spaces where holiday dinners had been shared, birthdays celebrated, arguments resolved. In my parents' former bedroom, now transformed into a sleek master suite unrecognizable from the cozy space where I'd sat with Mom during her illness, I whispered a goodbye not to the physical structure, but to the weight I had carried trying to preserve it exactly as it had been. The memories don't live in the walls, I realized. They live in me. The proceeds from the sale, fair market value split as our parents had intended, provided more than enough to establish a new chapter in my life. I purchased a sunlit condo across town, a space that had no history before me, where I could create something that was entirely my own. A portion of the funds went to establish a nursing scholarship in my parents' names at the hospital where I worked, transforming their legacy into something living and growing rather than frozen in time, within physical objects. The hardest lesson of the entire ordeal wasn't about property rights or family betrayal, but about the nature of home itself. I had fought so desperately to hold on to the physical house because I believed it contained my parents' presence, my childhood security, my sense of belonging. What I eventually discovered was that home isn't necessarily where you grew up or what you inherit. It's what you create for yourself, the boundaries you establish, the truth you insist upon, even when it's difficult. On my first night in the new condo, surrounded by boxes yet to be unpacked but arranged according to my own preferences, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me since before my parents' illness. The pain of James's betrayal hadn't disappeared. That wound would take years to fully heal, if it ever did. But the frantic need to preserve the past exactly as it had been had finally released its grip on me. I had learned that standing up for yourself doesn't always mean fighting to keep things the same. Sometimes it means having the courage to recognize when it's time to let go and move forward. As I unpacked the few family photographs I had kept, placing them on shelves among new purchases that reflected my own taste rather than inherited tradition, I felt my mother's presence not as a ghost tied to a physical location, but as a strength I carried within me. You were right, Mom, I whispered to her smiling image. I did need to stand up for myself, just not in the way either of us expected. The most valuable inheritance, it turned out, wasn't the house at all, but the quiet determination she had, modeled throughout her life. The same determination that had finally allowed me to fight for justice, and then, when that fight was won, to recognize that true freedom sometimes means opening your hands and letting go of what you once thought you couldn't live without. Have you ever had to stand up against a family member who tried to take advantage of you? What gave you the strength to finally draw the line? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Sometimes sharing our experiences helps others find the courage they need for their own battles. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Remember that standing up for yourself doesn't make you selfish. It makes you someone worthy of respect, starting with self-respect. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next video.